Hey, sophomores. This is my first opportunity to lecture over PowerPoints, so let's see how this goes. Today, I'm introducing our second memoir. Our first memoir was Elie Wiesel's Night, his reflections on his experience of being in Auschwitz during the Holocaust. And now we are going to learn about a second memoir, Jamaica Kincaid's memoir, A Small Place. Like Elie Wiesel's Night, it's a thin volume that has incredible power and asks us to consider what it is that constitutes nativeness. What does it mean to be an indigenous population in the Caribbean, a place that was completely recolonized by the Triangle of Trade, by slavery? So ultimately, we read this next memoir, a very different memoir of uh, tragic autocracy overtaking the life of an individual. The second memoir by Jamaica Kincaid, for the same reason that we read Elie Wiesel's memoir, to go ahead and consider what was it like for an individual. That quote that is often attributed to Stalin, that we actually don't think was Stalin, where he said, one death is powerful, but 50 million deaths is a statistic. I just messed up that quote, but you get the idea. Ultimately, by reading memoir, by understanding the way that things happen to individual people, empathy develops in readers. So ultimately, that's why we begin here. I asked my 10th graders to read this book, to read this short work of creative nonfiction, because we live in a really fortunate area. People are able to go ahead and visit beautiful islands, small places, but going ahead and making sure that you have an opportunity to consider what your impact as a traveling tourist is on small places like Antigua, the home of Jamaica Kincaid. That's the sort of personal work that I'd like you guys to do. Within this memoir, there are definitely some things that stung me, Matheny, as a traveler, somebody who likes to go as many places as possible, and considering with empathy how my mere presence in a place might trigger memories of colonialism and a lack of autonomy for individuals. That was an eye-opening for me. I ask you to read this book, guys, because when I read this book, there were times I was shook, legitimately shook. Two different ways you can read the book. You can go ahead and you can buy a copy of the text, as you know. I think it's going to take a while to get here on Amazon because of COVID-19, but there is a link posted on my website, and you are welcome to go ahead and access the book there. There will be further directions for you. So, like I said, you have access to the book, but you don't need to start reading today. Today is just about an introductory lecture. I want to begin, guys. I like to begin with the author. I want to introduce you to Jamaica Kincaid. Though she was born Elaine Cynthia Potter Richardson, she's taken the name Jamaica Kincaid as a way to go ahead and take control over her own life and over her own destiny. She sees the roots of colonialism in her original given name. She was born in 1949. That's powerful for me, Matheny, because my parents were also born in 1949. So considering how Jamaica Kincaid's experiences were different than those of my parents growing up in Montana and Missouri, considering that generation, has all of these different truths, that's just an important piece to consider. Now, what I'd like you guys to do at this point is I'd like you guys to go ahead and pause this slideshow. I'd like you to go ahead and go on my website, and I'd like you to spend about 5 good minutes at this time taking a look at some of the interviews with Jamaica Kincaid. If you're really into this, you can go ahead and you can read, watch a variety of different videos, right? One even by Oprah. I found one from Missouri because that's where I'm from. And there's a really short thing from blackpast.org that'll give you just the basic gist. So I'd like you to make sure that you read that required little excerpt, and then choose one or two of the other interviews to go ahead and consider what you learn about Jamaica Kincaid, her life, her experience, her writing process, the 2 honorary doctorates that she got, what it's like for her teaching at Harvard, what her life was like in Antigua long ago, and what her life is now like in Vermont, because she does choose to live here now. So take about 5 minutes now and go ahead and take a look at Jamaica Kincaid. Now, guys, like I said, I want to take a second to very quickly remind you why it is that we're choosing to read a second memoir. Elie Wiesel's memoir of German imperialism, right, is something that, helps us understand that particular genocide. But Kincaid's tone, her searing tone about the very sort of euphemistically positively labeled European colonization, but what was absolutely more effectively known as the impact of the triangle of trade, then we want to appreciate, right, that Kincaid is going to be sharing with us another story of tragedy, another story of enslavement, but it's going to look really different than what it is that you saw with Elie Wiesel. We're also going to appreciate that Kincaid is going to shift between second person and first person point of view. You're going to want to consider who she means by you. Again, I told you I was shook, and that was in part because of the fact that Jamaica Kincaid is somebody who, like, is critical of travelers, in particular white travelers, in terms of considering how they might go ahead and have a real negative impact. And that was an important part of reflection for me. I also want you to go ahead and consider how different groups receive this text in a very sort of I.B. Langenlit move. I.B. Langenlit isn't about just like saying a text means one thing. It's saying it's going to mean one thing to a group of students on the plateau and something entirely different to a group of students in Antigua reading it. So we're going to consider how individuals, people from Salman Rushdie to the New York Times, to some people that are very critical of this work from Antigua, how they might have received this text. Okay, so guys, I want to, now that I've had an opportunity to introduce you to our text and what it is that we're attempting to do with the text, I want to take you into our text structure. One of the reasons we explore long-form texts is to consider the way that authors choose to put them together. With Elie Wiesel's Night, we noticed that Wiesel chose not to use chapter divisions to go ahead and divide up the text. He chose to show that the Holocaust was, for him, one long night that continued long after the liberation of Auschwitz. Kincaid's is different. She's chosen to go ahead and rather than having just one long piece, right, Kincaid actually is going to go ahead and give us 4 different unnamed parts of varying lengths. Like Elie Wiesel, she chooses not to name these parts, but I'm going to give you a little bit of information. The first part is kind of imaginative. It's like, what would happen if a tourist arrived in Antigua? And that was really powerful for me as somebody who's a tourist. Just so you know, I haven't been to Antigua, and I would very much like to visit, but you'll see why I'm reticent once we've read this. The second part is an account of what it was like for Kincaid to grow up in Antigua. Her third part broadens its scope in order to consider the impact of Antiguans and the Antiguan government on the cultural legacy and cultural experience of Antigua. And in the last part, right, Kincaid returns to her title and she considers what is a small place? What does smallness mean, right? And how can a place overcome smallness if, in fact, it needs to? Okay, before we move on into the text, guys, I do want you to grab your copy of the book if you have it, and I want you to go ahead and I want you to consider the grayscale illustrations that you see on the page. There are 4 different grayscale illustrations that precede each of the 4 different sections of the text. And so I'd love for you guys to pause this video for just a second and go ahead and take a look at the grayscale illustrations. I'm hopeful that I'll remember to go ahead and scan those in and post those on my website just in case you don't already have those. When you do go ahead and look at those 4 grayscale illustrations, think about why it is that the publisher or Kincaid chose to go ahead and include images as well as text as a part of this sort of persuasive memoir. They didn't have to. That costs money. Why was that chosen? Why was this particular type of art chosen? So especially if you're into art, pause for 1 minute here and take a look through the book and consider what it is that you're learning. Hey guys, just kidding, I was able to insert these images. Here's the first grayscale image, so take a few seconds to go ahead and consider the purpose of including this imagery. Here's the second grayscale image, differing in perspective and composition from the first, populated by a larger group of people. Here's the fourth grayscale image, and this allows us to consider a perspective forward-facing and the movement of individuals and families. And finally, ultimately, we see our final grayscale image here, this one as an opportunity to go ahead and think about the ways that buildings that were built reflected colonial imperialistic tendencies. So I want to give you a moment today, guys, to go ahead and acquaint you with Antigua and Barbuda. Antigua and Barbuda are a part of the British Commonwealth, and Queen Elizabeth is ultimately on their money. But they are autonomous, and they actually did get to be independent from Britain, as I've mentioned, or as I will mention in my historical context lecture as we continue on. 91% of the individuals in Antigua and Barbuda identify as Black. They have moved there ultimately in order to, because they were moved as a result of the Triangle of Trade. This was a very initial stop on the passage, the Middle Passage over from Africa, and Antigua and Barbuda acted as a gateway within the Triangle of Trade as ships were going ahead and heading either to the southern United States or into Latin America to provide free labor for oftentimes cruel overlords. Make their home currently. And here's just a slightly closer map so that you can get a chance to see what that looks like if you've been to the area. Okay, so guys, she begins with this book called A Small Place, right? It's possible you feel like during pandemic your house is a small place, but I want you to consider what a small place means. She very much means this ideologically as well as geographically, and on some level, I see that as incredibly critical. I want you to consider the places that you live. Is the United States in any ways small geographically? Not so much, right? Relative to most countries. But are there any ways that you see us thinking platonically, chained within a cave, a metaphorical platonic cave, if you will? And in what way could that limited perspective make us small? So take a moment here and consider the title, and then consider pausing for about 10 seconds. Is Skyline a small place? In what ways? Okay, I want to go ahead and I want to share with you a little bit of historical context as well so that we can see why Jamaica Kincaid considers Antigua a small place and why she considers, right, other places, though geographically large, to be small, metaphorically as well. So a little bit of historical context lecture, so I'd like you to go ahead and just kind of listen. We're going to appreciate, ladies and gentlemen, that Antigua is an island in the West Indies. Apparently the West Indies, though that kind of refers to the Caribbean, and like to me harkens Columbus's misinterpretation of the Caribbean as India. I think that the West Indies actually still is a term that is being used and is not considered to be pejorative. So in this particular case, we're considering that Antigua is an island in what we call the West Indies. Christopher Columbus named the island Antigua, but ultimately it wasn't settled until later when they appreciated that slavery was possible in terms of the island population, the indigenous people, two groups, the Arawak and the Carib, or Carib, depending on how you'd like to say it. They are necessarily people who were decimated, right, by disease, malnutrition, slavery, smallpox, the same types of fates, unfortunately, that many indigenous populations fell victim to in the wake of Columbus's allegedly genocidal sort of journey. So what we want to get at is an important fact that I think that you need to consider, and what I want you to think about as citizens of Sammamish. The people of color who live on Antigua today, they are not descendant in large part from the island's indigenous people. They are a result of the fact that European colonists brought slaves to Antigua, and then those slaves, ultimately, upon their liberation, stayed. Largely because of the fact that they had to, because, leaving Antigua and returning to Africa generations later, certainly not something that's going to be viable for the vast majority of people. So the question that we have to ask ourselves now, in the Caribbean, what constitutes an indigenous population? What constitutes nativeness on an island? If everybody, almost, on an island is there as a result of the legacy of slavery. This next slide just gives you an opportunity to extend. If you're like, oh my gosh, more language arts, please. Chinua Achebe, who you probably remember from Things Fall Apart, he's written an essay called The African Writer and the English Language. And one of the things that I want you to think about is that Jamaica Kincaid chose to write this memoir in English. Jamaica Kincaid didn't have to. She could have chosen to write it in a language, right, that is more native. She could have chosen to write it in dialect. She could have chosen to do a variety of different things, and she didn't. She chose to use a far more standard English. So, what I want you guys to go ahead and I want you to consider that English, in this case, in Antigua, is the language of the colonial oppressors. And so, by using the language of the colonial oppressors to describe the experience of being oppressed, many authors feel limited by their ability to share. Achebe has always chosen to write about Africa in English, and he chooses to defend that choice. So I have an extra essay for you posted within this PowerPoint that allows you to think about that language meaning if you're interested. Okay, as we continue on, just a little bit more context about colonial Antigua and slavery, just so that you have more of an understanding of how the now allegedly native population sort of got there. In 1647, a British soldier realized that money could be made and monetized the sugar crops that were on the island. This first slave plantation was called Betty's Hope, and on the next slide you'll get a chance to see what Betty's Hope looked like. By 1780, there were 400 slaves living and working there, and as a result of the fact that that was an incredibly lucrative trade, the island became known as the gateway to the Caribbean. It was a strategic place where people could stop before continuing on with their cargo of slaves or with their cargo of valuable sugar. So Antigua's geographic privilege, quote unquote privilege, in this particular case, ultimately made it a very lucrative place for Europeans throughout the 16 and 1700s. You can see right here the very beginning of the sugar plantation, Betty's Hope. By 1834, Great Britain had formally emancipated the slaves in the colonies, and I think we just need to go ahead and appreciate that though, the emancipation of slaves is definitely something that should be celebrated, 1834, is late. Not nearly as late, however, as within the continental United States, or I'm sorry, the political United States. And so I think we need to appreciate by 1834, when this emancipation happened, we were still 30 years until we were going to fight our Civil War, and 50 years before the 13th Amendment was going to be ratified in the United States. So though I am quite critical, right, of any society that ever has slavery, I think we should appreciate that Great Britain did emancipate these slaves in Antigua before that happened in the United States by 50 years. We want to appreciate, though, that sugarcane and all of that did remain the dominant economic force in the plantation until the rise of tourism. And this sort of beat right here, the second bullet point that you see right here, is what I think Kincaid is attempting to align with this text. Though white people, though non-native populations that sought to monetize, right, what they found on the beautiful tropical island of Antigua, though in the beginning that was about slavery, eventually the second wave of tourists were tourists. It's not necessarily with absolutely no intention of enslaving the Antiguans, but by creating them as only a tourist destination, they reduce what the Antiguan population necessarily can be. It's not a slavery, but it's a mental slavery that ultimately does have an impact on the individuals that live in society. After slavery, by 1940, labor conditions for the formation of trade and labor unions. We see a similar thing happening in other places in Latin America, and you guys have taken a look at what that labor union spurring necessarily means. And then last but not least, Antigua fully gained independence from Britain in 1981. So at that point, they were able to go ahead and they were able to govern themselves. Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state. If you guys remember that video that we watched describing like what is the United Kingdom, Antigua and Barbuda are a part of that. Barbuda is a second island, which we'll talk about for just a second here. Tourism provides the dominant economy in Antigua, and like we said, that was absolutely decimated in 2017 when Hurricane Irma happened. A slide that I will show you on the next thing shows a couple of pictures of the ways that the entire tourist industry in 2017 was decimated. Here's a headline that you can see from the Independent publication that shows there's no one living on the island of Barbuda. Since it began, there were 1,800 people in Barbuda, but they all had to leave because their island was completely decimated. On this slide, you can see exactly where the hurricane went across. Hurricane Irma went across. So ladies and gentlemen, in order to go ahead and share with you just like the historical context for this book, I wanted to go ahead and give you just a brief overview of from 1632, right? That's when Columbus introduced the European diseases that decimated the local population. I regret that I'm not able to start with like a far more, um, you know, I don't know, a far more broad understanding of what the native populations in Antigua and Barbuda were like. That's something that I'll definitely continue to research. So I'm sorry that I'm starting this with slavery. But by 1632 is when we started to have records that are kind of easy for me to read and translate. So at that point, right, we appreciate that the monetization of sugar plantations and the use of slavery allowed a profitability to happen for Europeans in Antigua. And then over time, Jamaica Kincaid in 1949, just after the establishment of labor unions, just after Antigua is beginning to have some independence, she goes ahead and she is born. And then she is able to live a life and reflect upon her experience as someone who inherited the cultural legacy of the slave trade. So, my friends, over the course of the next couple of days, you guys are going to be hearing a little bit more about A Small Place, and then we'll be starting to actually read. I hope this introductory lecture gives you a sense of what's going on. So guys, last piece today, here's just a quick summary slide of the big themes that I want you to consider. This book is something that fits into many genres, though like I said, we're considering it as a part of our memoir unit. What I'm hopeful that you'll do is you'll consider both the smallness and the largeness, both geographically and metaphorically, of the places that we live in and the places that we travel to. So hopefully today gave you a little bit of context for the text. You don't need to read any part of A Small Place today. That will be what is part of what we're going to be starting to do tomorrow. Thank you guys. I hope you had a lovely day.